This is the third installment of what's called the Summer Analytics Academy webinar series. Today our topic is practical application of analytics in advising and administration. My name is Dr. Mitchell Culver, and I manage what's called the Center for Student Analytics here at Utah State University. And today's webinar is a follow-up to an event that we held in May called the Summer Analytics Academy, where we discussed kind of some approaches to collaborating in the use of analytics in the higher education space. The three webinar series has been a way to explore those theories in more practical settings, and today we're going to be talking about advising administration in particular and how to use analytics effectively in that space. To get started, I want to talk a little bit about this idea that when you turn on any kind of new system and you're engaged in any kind of innovation, or you buy or purchase or build an analytic system, if after you've turned that system on, if nothing changes at the institution, you have a very serious problem, right? So the whole point of activating a new initiative is that the university is then supposed to change. If the university continues to operate the way that it was operating when you didn't have the tool, then of course the point of activating that tool is moot. So we really want to focus on this idea that when we talk about practical analytics in advising administration, that we're going to have to be engaged in some kind of change management to deliver on the promise of analytics. And so that's the subtitle of today's webinar, is this idea that you can use change management to shape and hone the innovations that occur in the academic advising space. Now, I want to talk about that in terms of what do we mean by the promise of analytics? Well, there is this idea that by using analytics, we're going to improve student well-being, which is true. But I also want to speak to the idea that a main feature of analytics is that they help you to optimize the university. So here we have two kinds of ways of using analytics to be successful, to deliver on its promise. The first is what I think most people think of when they hear advising analytics, is this kind of intervention analytics, reaching out to students through some kind of CRM or messaging system, using predictive models to basically target outreach to students and to say, can we assist you? This intervention analytics they're an important part of the analytics space, but we never want to be so focused on the fact that we can do this kind of outreach to students that we miss the opportunity to also perform some optimization activities, where we not only do new work, the new work of using analytics to reach out to students, but also we do the work of optimizing the institution, optimizing the leadership around a given topic, for example, academic advising. And today's webinar is really more focused on that optimization. And if you're going to be optimizing a space, helping to streamline leadership, streamline workflows, streamline kind of expectations of practice, then you're definitely going to use empowerment to do that. This is our divisional mission statement here at Utah State University. I belong to what's called AIS, which is kind of like a service division. And it says, we believe everything we do is about people. Working together, we provide the highest level of service to each other, our students, and our clients. Our overarching goal is to provide an organization wherein individuals are empowered to be successful. Now, empowerment is an important element of change leadership because it's very difficult to affect change at a large institution without engaging in some kind of change leadership, right? That if your hope is to help people to feel empowered, then change leadership allows you to do that without putting people under your thumb, or what's written on the screen here is that you cannot mandate excellence. I've seen a lot of institutions that try to innovate by basically turning on analytics and mandating that everyone will do such and so. And that hopefully just happens. But usually what I've seen is that when you try to mandate excellence or mandate this kind of use of analytics in a workflow, in an everyday workflow, what you produce is kind of a debilitating kind of lack of morale where people feel put upon. But if you want to see change, it doesn't mean that you have to mandate it. Instead, you can cultivate it, right? This idea of empowerment comes from this idea of how do we work and lead individuals, leaders of the institution, the actual faculty and staff of the institution, to make changes. And this is kind of the bread and butter of my work in the Center for Student Analytics, is helping people to feel like they can make the effective changes that they need to make in either their professional role or in their leadership role for the institution. And to do that, we just don't hope that change will happen. We're not just friendly about change, and we don't just have conversations about change. We actually use a change equation, right? So this is a framework that helps us to think through, if we want to produce change at the institution, especially at the leadership level, how can we engage leadership, how can we engage faculty and staff in a way that actually produces the change that we hope to see? Well, this is the Becker-Harris change equation. And it's pretty easy to understand. It says change is equivalent to dissatisfaction times vision times first steps, and all of those must be greater than resistance in order to enact change. Well, an important element of this equation is that the first three letters, D, V, and F, they're all multiplied by each other. So if any one of those zeroes out, you have a real serious problem, right? If you have a situation where people are not dissatisfied with the status quo, then there will be no change. Because why would people change if there's no level of satisfaction? If you can't provide people with vision, even if there's high levels of dissatisfaction, and even if there's some kind of first steps that are supposed to take place, if people don't have a vision of the ultimate goal or the why of the change, then of course the equation will zero out and you won't see change. And then also you can have dissatisfaction and vision, but if you don't actually give people tangible things to do, tangible first steps to take towards change, then of course you're not going to see the change. So my hope today is to take us through this equation using the example of how we have worked with our advising administrators or basically those who oversee academic advising, how we have used this equation to affect change amongst that target audience, okay? So step one is dissatisfaction. How do you stir up a little dissatisfaction? How do you make people aware of the fact that they should be dissatisfied? If there's something that's not working at the institution, you kind of alert people to that. How do you do that? Well, if you're going to stir up a little dissatisfaction, you should always start by acknowledging successes, right? Some successes. This idea that you cannot just go around and fire out of a cannon a whole bunch of content that is meant to make people upset. What we decided to do is to actually go around and talk about the high value that academic advising has, right? We start with this idea of saying to people who oversee advising, advising is really very successful. This is a table of results that show various co-curricular and extracurricular initiatives at our university. And each one of these has been put through a propensity score match analysis, a quasi-experimental design, trying to figure out, after controlling for student input variables, how does student participation in any one of these services lead to increase in their likelihood to persist towards graduation? So what you see here is these kind of percent lifts in student persistence that we see when a student participates in academic advising, or maybe a better way to describe it is when 100 students participate in academic advising. You'll see about 5.59% of those students persist when they otherwise would not have. And we use propensity score match to figure that out. And so it's a quasi-experimental estimation of a causal link between these services and student retention. Well, these numbers are now actually comparable because different services scale to different levels, right? So what I want you to look at as on this next slide is this idea that as a service is able to be scaled to a larger number of students or a smaller number of students, then you kind of have to multiply out the lift that you can see, or the potency of the given initiative, by its scalability, right? So something like the Writing Center, even though it's 3.1% influencing students' likelihood to persist, because the Writing Center serves such a smaller amount or smaller number of students than the next highest listed supplemental instruction, 2.83% lift, which can serve way more, then we actually see a lot bigger ROI on the supplemental instruction than we do for the Writing Center, right? And you can kind of look at this chart and see all these different services have different impacts on our ability to keep students here and to help them receive degrees, right? ROI is just a measure of how many students are we getting coming back, right? Well, you can see that academic advising, it not only is this huge increase in our retained tuition revenue, but it's scalable across a large number of students, right? It's easy to see why advising is so potent and powerful. And this is partly what we wanted people that we were sharing this information with. We wanted them to understand, hey, when you dump resources into academic advising, and when you can get academic advisors to meet with the right students, we really see large dividends for our students and for our university. And so we really want to encourage people to champion the powerful effects that academic advising can have. Another way to look at this, another way that we looked at this was by putting a whole bunch of variables, even more than are listed. We ran out of space. The chart actually extends well below what is shown here. These are all a whole bunch of variables that help us predict student well-being at Utah State University. And this is called a random forest, and basically the percents being shown there are the percents of the branches of a random forest, which is kind of technical talk. But how basically it's a ranking of importance, how important something is. And you can see advising after end of term GPA, which I think most people understand is fairly important for predicting student well-being at the university, and number of days spent on Canvas, our learning management system. Advising turned out to be a really good predictor, right? And it showed up twice here near the top. And so when we're thinking about student well-being, all these variables kind of are ways of envisioning how well students are doing. And not only meeting with an advisor at least once, but the overall number of advising appointments seems to have a pretty strong importance for student well-being and when we're trying to predict persistence into the next semester. So the overall message of these last two charts, this one here and this one here, is just that advising matters. Advising is important. It's one of the most important co-curricular things that a student can participate in at our institution. Okay. Now, once you understand that advising is important, you need to understand that advising doesn't affect all students in the same way. What we have here is a graph that shows the 4 success quartiles of our student body, right? So our student body is broken into 4 success quartiles. These are basically how likely students are to persist based on all the inputs and things that they bring to the table. Well, you can see the navy blue or the dark blue bars here are students who participated in advising, and the light blue bars are students who didn't participate in advising. And you can see that advising for our top quartile students makes less than a 1% difference in their likelihood to stay with the institution. Partly you can understand that. You could say, well, those students who are extraordinarily likely to be successful, they're going to kind of persist towards graduation in spite of what we do. It's not that we shouldn't meet with them, but it just this understanding that they're checking all the boxes and making sure that everything is taken care of in their academic lives. As we move down there in the third quartile, you can see a 4% difference increase in student persistence when they meet with an academic advisor, and then a 10% difference at the second quartile, and a 13% gain for our bottom quartile students. And so obviously the bottom quartile students are most impacted. Of course they would be. Right? They have the most to gain from getting the support of an academic advisor. And when that support is given, we see in these numbers that students are persisting at 13 percentage points higher than when they don't meet with an advisor, at least in that bottom quartile. So the next question you would say is well, if our advising work doesn't impact students all in the same way, where are we spending most of our time? Because if I'm spending most of my time with top quartile students, I'm making almost no difference in their likelihood to stick around. It's not that it's not important to meet with them, but that I'm not doing a delta with them. I'm not making a big change. But if I'm meeting with bottom quartile students, then I'm going to see this big change. Well, we can look. So we've done this over several years now, spring 2018, spring 2019. And what we've seen is that this is spring 2019, is that we're serving a lot higher percentage of our top quartile students than our bottom quartile students. And this is dismaying, right? This is where, when I'm talking about the Becker-Harris change equation, and I'm trying to stir up a little dissatisfaction, this is where I'm stirring up the dissatisfaction. I'm saying we have a situation here where there's a disparity. We are not serving the students for whom our services make the biggest impact. We're serving them significantly less often than our students for whom our services make the least impact. And that can be a little bit disconcerting when you start to put together the impact that this might be having on retention numbers, right? And so we wanted to share this. We did share this with the deans in a report that we put together to try to go to the deans who oversee academic advisors in our colleges and to say, hey, we really want to see a change here and we want you to understand why we're asking this change to occur. I think everyone can look at these numbers and see that there's cause for being dissatisfied. And I think most of the deans were very receptive to that. They agreed, yeah, this doesn't look right, okay? Now, the next step of the Becker-Harris change equation is vision, right? It's not sufficient to simply provide why there's a problem at the institution and why the status quo needs to change. But you also need to provide vision for how might it could look different. And so this next segment of the presentation is about that very idea. So here's our table. We're dissatisfied. Let's start looking at vision in terms of how could this be different, and if it were different, what would that produce? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add two columns here. One showing potential increase in number of appointments that we could serve students. So the idea here is potential increases is what if we could get more students to come to appointments? For example, what if we get 100 more appointments each semester for each quartile, right? So in our top quartile, instead of meeting with 2,063 students, what if we could add 100 appointments to that? In the third quartile, instead of meeting with 2,283 students, what if we could add 100 students, right? So we're adding 100 students in each quartile, 400 appointments overall, which is actually fairly realistic. 2 years ago, 2017, we did a push to get a lot more appointments happening in October and November, where we saw really good signal for if a student were to meet with their advisor in October, November, it was advantageous. And through just a very simple kind of administrative push of saying, hey, what can we do to get more students seen, we were able to see 1,700 more students as an institution, right? And that was it wasn't a heavy lift. It was a very just kind of like, hey, what can we do to see more students? And pretty soon we had 1,700 more through appointments. So this 400 student appointment is actually really reasonable. It's not a high reach. It's almost like it's kind of a silly one, but it's meant to illustrate a point here. So if we were to see 100 additional students in each quartile, remembering back to this chart I just showed, right, where our top quartile students are least affected and our bottom quartile students are most affected, what kind of persistence gains would we expect from that increase in appointments? Well, for 100 top quartile students, we'd see one student sticking around who otherwise would have left the institution. For our third quartile students, meeting at 100 additional students, we would see a 4 student gain in persistence. Second quartile, we would see a 10 student gain, and then the bottom quartile, we'd see 13 student gains, right? And those are just easy to figure out, right? Because we're talking about 100 students, so we're talking about the percentage lift overall, right? So this is why I did this. So overall, 400 appointments would net 28 students. That's if they're evenly spread through the 4 quartiles. So I think that makes sense. Now it's important to understand that we could never have done this without analytics. Our ability to know the persistence gains comes from this impact analysis that we did using a projection-based propensity score match system provided to us by Civitas Learning. Without those analytics, we couldn't even deduce that our work doesn't impact students all in the same way, and at what degree. And our ability to say that these gains would result from this level of engagement with students derives directly from newly available analytics tools. And this is when we're talking about the promise of analytics to not just help us to reach out to students, but the promise of analytics to help us optimize the institution. This is what we're talking about. The ability to even have this conversation comes from the presence of analytics in the institution. Now we have a question, and you can type questions in, by the way, while I'm going along here. Maggie Davidson asks, how did you break students into quartiles? That's a really good question, Maggie. So the quartiles are generated by a logistic regression. We build a massive risk model for all of our undergraduate students. We partner with a vendor to do that, Civitas Learning. That large risk model for each student predicts the relative likelihood that they're going to persist into the next semester. So for 16,000 students, we break those into 4 quartiles. Each quartile has about 4,000 students. So the top quartile basically has a little over 4,000 students who are the most likely to persist based on this logistic regression into the next semester. And that the accuracy of that prediction model, some people say, well, how accurate could that be? The accuracy is at 88% accurate. So 88% of our predictions about how students are going to progress and succeed at the institution are accurate based on those metrics. So these quartiles are built out around basically using a logistic regression and hundreds of variables to kind of forecast how likely a student is going to be successful to progress towards graduation. Maggie says, thank you for that answer. How do you get the data on who attended the different activities and who did not? I can't even begin to think how we would do that. Okay, so for advising, we have appointment manager. So every appointment that a student has with the academic advisor gets logged. At least, I would say maybe 90% of those appointments. We're still working to get every advisor to adopt that tool. For the other things that you were seeing, like the supplemental instruction and the writing center, we have disparate data systems all over campus, and part of the role of the Center for Student Analytics, which I manage, is to go around and to federate all that data into a usable space, right? So a big heavy lift that we do is making sure that the institution's data about student participation in co-curricular and extracurricular activities is not only just being collected, which is important, but that it's being stored in a way that's accessible to analysts like me and my staff who can then actually go in and do these analyses. And so it's a really good question because without the analytics, we wouldn't even have a need necessarily to federate all that data, but we've done some really delicate and important work to get all that data into a space, all that co-curricular, extracurricular data into a space where we can actually scope how students are engaging with the different offerings of the institution. It's really important work, and there's other webinars about that too, so really good question. Okay, so let's get back to vision, right? So this vision we want to create. So this chart on the screen here shows if we were to increase 100 appointments across each quartile, what kind of gains could we expect? But what if we were to say we wanted to see 70% of all caseloads advised, right? So if we were to take that 47.4% that we're currently averaging across the institution, and we were to bump it up to 70%, which I think is also a very feasible lift, right? It's a very feasible thing to do because we actually have seen colleges, one of our colleges basically made a commitment to themselves that they would do that. They would see 70% of their students, and they were able to get fairly close, right? In the mid-60s and above, and basically this is not a heavy lift. This is something that with intentionality you could do. So what kind of potential increase would that be? Well, it would be 3,760 additional appointments across the entire institution. They would be spread differently, unit by unit, or quartile by quartile, because top quartile students are already being seen 57% of the time. So to get up to 70% is only a 13 percentage point increase, or that's represented by 464 additional appointments for our top quartile students. The third, it's an additional 600 and so forth. Well, what kind of gains would we expect? If we were able to see 3,700 students, which, like I say, with the right intentionality, I think that's well within hand, what kind of persistence gains would we see? Well, this is the really surprising thing. For those 464 appointments in the top quartile, we'd see a 3-student gain in persistence. It's a lot of work to change the lives of 3 students. Not that it's not important. It just is it's a lot of heavy lifting just to have that little piddly effect. For our third quartile, we'd see a 27-student increase in persistence. Second quartile, we'd retain 115 students, and for that bottom quartile, we'd retain 200 students. And notice the discrepancy here. So for the top quartile, if we meet with 464 students, then we retain 3 more than we otherwise would have. In the bottom quartile, if we meet with 3 times as many students, right, 1,500 instead of this 464, we get 200 students. So for meeting with 3 times as many students, we see a 33 times the impact on our student population. So it doesn't take long to realize, well, why even worry about top quartile students or even third quartile students? Why? If we're going to target, if we're going to do this, if we're going to do an additional 3,700 appointments, let's do them. Let's target them, right? So the next idea is what if we were to do targeted outreach? What if we were to have a 3,760 appointment increase? So it's the same as on the last slide, right, where we saw 345 student gain. What if we were to meet with the same number of students but target all of those students in the second and bottom quartile? So the students for whom Our services make the biggest difference. Those are the students we want to see coming through the door. And with analytics, we can do this, right? Our advising workflow now advisors have the ability to pull up the students who are most at risk, these bottom quartile, second quartile students, and pull them in and do differentiated outreach. Not just send an email, but call them, text them, and say, hey, I really want to spend time with you. I'm your academic advisor. Our relationship is not only important now, but it's going to continue to be important as you persist towards graduation. It's going to become increasingly important. And so come in and see me. Get in here and see me. Well, what kind of gains would we see? Well, you have to remember that before, when all of these are spread across all the quartiles, we saw 345 students gain. Now, with targeted outreach, we actually see gains 100 students more, so 445 students gain, right? And these kind of estimates are pretty conservative, actually. We're pretty sure that we could see this happen, partly because one of our campuses down in Price, Utah, they went from from a model of not requiring students to meet with their advisors to requiring all students to meet with advisors, and they saw a 9 percentage point increase in persistence. So that's making everyone meet with an advisor. Suddenly their persistence rate jumps 9%. Here, what we're kind of averaging out here is kind of almost like a 6%. So it's a little bit conservative. These estimates are really accurate, but also very conservative, and that's, I think, very compelling. So this idea is that we could target outreach to those same 3,700 appointments, and then that would lead to 2.7% increase in retention, right? So a 6% increase in persistence, but in retention, 2.7% increase in retention. And that's basically term versus semester, okay? And so that's for the institution, right? So institution-wide, we would see an increase of these 16,000 students. The 445 is 2.7% increase. It's really compelling. And so that's kind of the vision. You can see how this is a vision. You share this with people and they start to say, oh, I get it. We need not only to meet with more students, a higher percentage of our caseload, but we need to target that outreach to students for whom our contact matters the most. So that's the dissatisfaction, that's the vision. Now what are the first steps? Well, the first thing is, I think it's a very fair question, is to ask about the feasibility. How feasible is this? Is this even very feasible to accomplish? And we've kind of gone around and spoken with academic advisors and have said, what inhibits your ability to use analytics tools for targeted outreach to meet with a higher proportion of your caseload? And the first thing that has been said is caseload sizes. If we can't get our caseloads down to 300, 350, there's no way we're going to be able to do targeted outreach. And I think that's really legitimate. Before we started doing this work, we had advisors with 700 students. We had one advisor with more than 1,000 students on our caseload. Those were exceptions. They were outliers, but it was happening. And after this kind of report went before the deans last November, the deans started taking it very seriously. I mean, you're going to see this here in a minute. Some of the results, some of the changes they made. Other assigned duties, right? So advisors will say, we welcome additional duties, party planning and recruiting and these kinds of things. They can be really rewarding. But if I'm doing all these other things on the side, I'm not going to have time to meet with my entire caseload or an increasing percentage of my caseload. So unless you can get and protect and insulate me from these other duties as assigned and really just use me to meet with students instead of using me to, go and meet with whoever and just put on a good face, then I'm not going to be able to do this outreach, right? For some of our advisors, lack of administrative oversight was the issue, right? So we had one advisor who basically reported, I don't know who my supervisor is. I think on paper it's the departmental secretary. I think the department head thinks it's this faculty advisor that I work with, and the faculty advisor doesn't think it's him, so I don't know who it is. And when I went and talked to the department head, her response was, oh yeah, it's the faculty advisor. But the faculty advisor was like, no, I'm not the supervisor of this advisor. So it was very upsetting for this advisor to not know to whom she was accountable and who would fill out her performance evaluation each year. But even more than that level, we know that a lot of times the deans didn't even have insight, and the associate deans didn't even have insights into how well their different colleges were performing in terms of these figures and these numbers. And we created a Dean's report, and I'm going to show you here in a second, that basically outlined for each of the colleges, here's how you're doing, here's kind of benchmarked against all the other colleges at our university, how your advisors are doing in terms of their ability to meet with students. Without that administrative oversight, of course, there will not be increased resources. There will not be a strategy, a coherent strategy. And so part of our work has been helping to develop out administrative awareness of these important issues. There's some other things listed here I don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time on, but there was this idea that advisors felt like they were doing enough, partly because they were meeting with high-performing students. High-performing students are happy to come in. They come through your door all day long. They're happy when they leave out the door. And so it left advisors kind of feeling, oh, I feel good because the students I'm meeting with like me. But unfortunately, it was all these top quartile students. And so, of course, the work was smooth, right? And so there was kind of this lack of dissatisfaction amongst advisors because everyone they met with seemed to be having a good time. But these advisors didn't realize they were allowing a lot of their students in their caseload to fall beneath their cracks. Of course, analytics help to ameliorate that. Analytics highlight those students for whom our outreach might matter the most. And then there's this other angle to some of our units, advising units, unfortunately, were taking this line of, well, if a student's at risk, maybe they shouldn't be at the university. And I'm not going to reach out to them, but I'm going to, maybe it's good reason, good riddance. It's a good reason for them not to be here. And we don't think that's appropriate, not only just because it's like from an ethical standpoint, moral standpoint, we don't agree with it, but the data doesn't reflect that, right? When we meet with these students, when we give them the necessary supports, we see that they can actually be successful. And so this idea that if a student's at risk, it's an excuse to not meet with them, is just completely flipped on its head. It's reverse. When a student is at risk, we know, and it's not just our data that shows this, but research reports across the country in well-reviewed, peer-reviewed journals show that when you reach out to students who are at risk and you give them the necessary supports, they well exceed expectations, even the expectations of their peers. And so that last one is just kind of a little bit silly. Okay, so it's feasible. I do think it's feasible, but there are these constraints and we do need to work on them. So remember, we're talking about change management and empowerment. So how do we empower these changes? We don't want to be jerks about this. We don't want to just go around and say, everyone will meet with their bottom quartile students or else, or this kind of thing. We don't want to do that. It's all about service, helping people to feel like they can choose to do the right work, right? You cannot mandate excellence, but you can cultivate it, and that was the goal here. So we wrote this Dean's report. We call it the Dean's report. The title is Advisor Analytics, New Insights in Advising Best Practice. We made it really clear to the deans that everything contained in this report was new. It was nothing that anyone was going to be slapped on the wrist for because it wasn't something we could know before we turned analytics systems on. Paying for analytics, turning the systems on, gave us new lenses through which to view the health of the institution. And while some of what was revealed was that we weren't performing to a level that was helping our most at-risk students, in a lot of ways we couldn't have known that before 2017, 2018, 2019, because analytics just weren't around. And so we really made it clear that this report wasn't addressing down of the colleges, it wasn't calling anyone onto the carpet. It was just stuff we had never known before. It was new insights, right, that we could never have had before. So this is called the Dean's Report. You can download it at this website and read through the whole darn thing. It's very similar to the content I'm presenting now. ais.usu.edu/analytics/innovation, and it's kind of at the bottom of that page. But this is the report that we use to not only create dissatisfaction and vision, but also talk about first steps. So what kind of first steps emerged, right? Well, in the process of explaining all this to the deans, kind of at the Dean's Council, one of the deans kind of ultimately said, kind of towards the end of the meeting, he said, I think it's time to make a change. You're telling us that what we've been doing so far has been okay, but that we could be doing better. And I agree. And I think now that we know that the status quo isn't sufficient and is not going to lead to the kind of results we want to see at our fine university, then we better step up and make a change. So I'm going to give you two examples, two different deans who we had subsequently met with and kind of crafted what kind of changes do you want to make. So the first is Craig Jessup, Dean of the College of Arts. Now, Craig has since been transitioned out of that, or he offered to resign that role and give it to another individual. Dean Nardo is now in that place. And so this is kind of before Craig stepped down. But picture it here. The first image is Craig Jessup. The middle image is an associate dean that works in that college, Chris Terry. And the third image is another associate dean, Nick Morrison. Now, I think it's kind of unusual for me to be showing these faces. Like in a presentation, you don't expect pictures of deans and associate deans to be thrown up on the slides, but it's important to understand that when you're talking about change management, if an institution is going to change, it's going to be the people that change. There's this idea first presented in the 70s by this philosopher Wyeth. And basically he said organizations they're not really real. They're not the buildings and the rooms and like the brand. All of that is a facade. Organizations are really just people. That you could take an organization, keep all the people the same and change the name and put a new sign on front. You have the same organization, it's just a different name. If you take a set of buildings, like a university, our entire university and all of its buildings, and you clear them out of all the people, and you move those people somewhere else in the country, and you bring in all new people, you get a completely new organization because the buildings don't actually affect like what is happening, right? Organizations are people. And if you're going to change an organization, if you're going to change a structure, you're going to change it in people. So I'm showing people here to emphasize that we didn't change the College of Arts. We didn't convince the College of Arts to change. We convinced Craig and Chris and Nick to bring together their department heads, to bring together their kind of administrative council and have a conversation about this data. And that's exactly what happened. They invited us to this meeting. We kind of sat there and talked through all of the insights that I've already gone over. And Chris Terry in the middle, he kind of said, well, in the College of Arts, we've always used faculty as academic advisors. We always thought that was appropriate. But based on everything we're seeing, we really think that it needs to be professional advisors. And so we're now committed to actually transitioning faculty into more of a mentoring role, which they'll want to continue to function as. But for the true academic advising, degree planning, graduation application, that kind of stuff, we are going to put that entirely in the wheelhouse of professional advisors, and that means we're going to have to hire another academic advisor in order to meet the demand. And so this leadership team not only heard the message of dissatisfaction and vision, but for them the first step was not only taking advising and repositioning it with professional advisors and then really keeping that important mentoring role for faculty, but also hiring additional staff so that they can meet the demands that we were basically saying. And so this was not only a very tangible first step, but it was a very feasible one. It was something they could see the value of doing, and that money would pay dividends, would pay a return on investment, investing in advising. So that's the first example. And you can see it's the people who kind of have to go, oh, I get it. I want to do this differently than we've done it before. The next example is the College of Science. So this is Mara Hagen, Dean in the College of Science, and this is Greg Podgorski, who is an associate dean. Now, at the time we were working with Mara on this, Greg had not been hired into his associate dean role. But in the meeting with Mara, we had a follow-up meeting with her and her previous associate dean, Dick Mueller, and we basically talked with them through this report, and over the course of the meeting, they came to this kind of realization that their associate dean the position description had not been written in a way that would really provide the administrative oversight that advisors would need. And so there was kind of this arm's length administrative relationship between the associate dean and the advisors in the College of Science. And Mara's take and was basically, we need to write this position and fill this position based on an individual's ability to have a really high-touch relationship with these academic advisors, to understand the expectations, to understand the possibilities, to take this kind of dissatisfaction and vision and really leverage it towards the kind of service that we want to see to our students in the College of Science. So that position kind of got spruced up. The previous associate dean was retiring, so it was a perfect opportunity to change the description. And when Greg was hired, I started meeting with him and going over these same insights, and we've continued to have those meetings and they've gone very well. Greg, I'm very excited about the meetings that I've been having with Greg as an associate dean, because he sees the vision and he sees the reason why we should be dissatisfied. And again, I very much have the understanding that he's not going to go in and try to mandate excellence, but instead is going to take the same approach of empowerment, of persuasion, of playing the long game to help his academic advisors to not only have a closer relationship with this kind of oversight, but also to understand the importance of making these changes, right? So he's going to work on his people. So there's 2 examples. There's more, but you get the idea. When you want to do change management, change leadership, when you want to empower, you're thinking about people. You're not thinking I wasn't thinking about the College of Science or the College of Arts. I was thinking about, these individuals, these faces. Now, nicely, we have seen that when these kind of changes get made, it leads to strong increases in our students' likelihood to persist towards graduation. So if you look from about 2012 to 2017, gains in persistence year over year were kind of just quite low. So 0.13%, 0.45%, 0.09%. So we were seeing 20 and 72 and 15% or 15 student increases in our student counts, right? And then in 2018, we saw this huge increase in students' persistence from spring to fall semester, right? It was 2.34%, or it was 369 students. It was 10 times the 3-year average of 35 students. And when we investigated, right, this was a change where we could look and we saw, well, we see that being concentrated in this one particular college. Now, it's spread out over all the colleges, but in particular, this one college, what's listed here as College 7, this is where we were seeing these gains, right? Well, this is the college that kind of took the promise of analytics and leveraged it towards meeting a high percentage of their students in each quartile, right? And so this is kind of the goal. If you want to meet with 70% of your students, this is kind of what it looks like. This is setting that goal and kind of going for it. The mean is in the far right column, right, for the entire institution. Here's the 8 colleges and then the exploratory unit as well. And you can see with a concerted effort using analytics, they were able to get all of their caseload service up to a quite high percent, which is very exciting. And the gains in that persistence, like I had said earlier, were all concentrated, right? Their gains in persistence were 3 times higher than average. And we saw a similar trend across all units. Now, this 4.13 is asterisked because those gains were seen because an advising center had been moved from a out-of-the-way corner of the institution to a main hallway in that college's main building. And so those 4.13% gains were all concentrated amongst freshmen. That was a good move, right? It didn't have anything to do with analytics, right? But what this chart shows is that there was a strong correlation between advisor use of analytics to target outreach and the increases in persistence that we saw in 2018 spring to fall. It was a 207 student increase, and it's about $500,000 in retained tuition, which is pretty exciting. So these are when you think about that change management formula, dissatisfaction, vision, and first steps, these kinds of analytics are helping us to really practically think about how can we optimize the institution. Remember what I had said earlier is it's not just about reaching out to more students, which is important. I think that is important. Intervention analytics are a core element of these changes, but it's also about having kind of a 30,000-foot view down on the holistic picture of how we can optimize the university and make structural changes in terms of moving advising from faculty to professional advisors, keeping the faculty in a mentoring role. In terms of hiring an associate dean to specifically oversee advisor well-being and professionalism, right? So these kinds of optimization activities are really key to the promise of analytics. And that's my overarching message to you, is that when we want to get practical about running an institution, analytics help us to see where there are opportunities for improvement and where we may need to have a little dissatisfaction They help us produce the vision that we need in order to even envision what the changes could be, and they also help us plan those first steps. So I want to open it up to Q&A. So anyone who would like to ask a question, you'll type your question into the chat box. This is the end of a 3-part webinar series, and so everyone who's attended or received the video link, I will likely be sending out a survey, kind of a quality survey, like how did it go, what did you like, what could be better. We had done a webinar last year, and then we've done 6 webinars this year, 3 in January, February, March, and then 3 over the summer. And we're trying to gauge the level of interest in us continuing to do these webinars. I'll be sending that out. So if you have any questions, type those into the chat box now. I should say that one idea that we have for our webinar series for late fall, maybe October, November, December, is to switch away from me as the talking head, which I would think everyone would welcome, to our data wrangler at the Center for Student Analytics. Her name is Amanda Hagman, and she does program evaluation. And so she may have kind of a webinar series in her where she can put together 3 slide decks and produce a series for everyone. And so if that's something you'd be interested in, please feel free to email me as well. I've kind of given it a few seconds here to see if anyone was going to type in any questions. I don't see any questions being typed in. Will, you sent out the slideshow. I'll send out a video recording of the webinar. Yeah, in about a week, we'll send out a YouTube link. And so you'll be able to review the slides in that recording. That's a great question, Andrea. Any other questions before we close out here? Can we get access to the previous webinars? Yeah, so in the chat box, I'm going to type in a web address, ais.usu.edu/analytics/media. So that's now in the chat box. And that is where all of our webinars are archived. And there's like I say, there's now 7 that will be there. And then there's some other content there that you can also review. That's a good question. So those are all there in a repository. So, and then obviously you can always reach out by email if you have further questions. Well, thank you so much for attending. This concludes our summer webinar series, and I appreciate your time. And have a good afternoon. Thank you so much.